When we think about World War I, most of us picture trenches, mustard gas, and soldiers charging into machine gun fire. But have you ever stopped to wonder how a single bullet in a small Bosnian city could pull the entire world into a bloodbath that killed 17 million people? Have you ever heard about the Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers from both sides stopped fighting to play football and sing carols together? Did you know that the youngest soldier in WWI was just 12 years old and that he actually served on the front lines? What if I told you that the war ended not because one side won decisively, but because everyone simply ran out of young men to send into the meat grinder? If these questions make you curious, then this story is going to completely change how you see the so-called Great War. The year was 1914, and Europe was sitting on a powder keg that had been building for decades. Everyone knew something was coming, but nobody thought it would be this catastrophic. You had the British Empire controlling a quarter of the world's land and people. You had France still bitter about losing territory to Germany in 1871. You had Germany itself, a new power hungry for its place in the sun, building a navy that threatened Britain's centuries-old dominance. You had Austria-Hungary, this patchwork empire of 11 different nationalities held together by aging Habsburg rulers who barely spoke the same language as their subjects. And you had Russia, this massive backward giant ruled by a Tsar who still believed in divine right while his people starved. All of these powers were tied together by a web of alliances that basically guaranteed that if any two went to war, everyone would be dragged in. Now, the spark that lit this powder keg came from the most unlikely place. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, decided to visit this restless province where Serbian nationalists dreamed of uniting all South Slavs. His security was a joke by modern standards. The motorcade route was published in newspapers. There were only 6 security agents for the entire visit. The first attempt failed when a bomb bounced off his car and exploded behind him. But instead of canceling, the Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded in hospital. His driver took a wrong turn, stalled the engine while trying to reverse, and by pure chance, parked right in front of a sandwich shop where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip was standing. Having given up after the earlier failed attempt, Princip stepped forward, fired 2 shots from a pistol, and changed the world forever. The Archduke and his pregnant wife Sophie died within minutes. And because of alliance systems, because of railway timetables that couldn't be changed, because of pride and stupidity and fear, within 37 days the entire continent was at war. The initial weeks were nothing like what anyone expected. Everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. The Germans had this massive plan called the Schlieffen Plan, designed to knock out France quickly before Russia could mobilize its huge but slow army in the east. It almost worked. German armies swept through Belgium, committing atrocities that turned world opinion against them, and drove deep into northern France. The French, wearing bright blue uniforms and red trousers that made them perfect targets, launched massive suicidal charges into German machine guns. At the Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914, France lost 27,000 men in a single day. To put that in perspective, that's more than America lost in the entire Vietnam War in just 24 hours. And it accomplished absolutely nothing. Then came the miracle of the Marne. In September 1914, French and British forces, using taxis from Paris to rush reinforcements to the front, managed to halt the German advance just 30 miles from the capital. Both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea, digging in as they went. Until by November 1914 there was a continuous line of trenches, stretching from the Swiss border to the English Channel. And that's where the real horror began. 4 years of static warfare where gains were measured in yards, where millions of men lived in muddy holes, where rats grew fat on corpses, and where the sound of artillery became so constant that soldiers stopped noticing it. Life in the trenches was a special kind of hell that we can barely imagine today. Imagine standing in water up to your knees for days at a time, your feet rotting from trench foot, your clothes never dry, your food cold and infested with weevils. Imagine the smell, this incredible combination of rotting bodies, human waste, cordite, and mud that never left your nostrils. Imagine knowing that at any moment, a random shell could land on your position and end everything. Soldiers developed what they called shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, from the constant psychological pressure. Men would go mad from the sound of artillery, standing up and walking into no man's land as if in a trance. Others would develop nervous tics, stutters, uncontrollable shaking. The military response was often to charge them with cowardice and execute them. The technology of killing evolved at a terrifying pace during these years. At the start of the war, cavalry charges were still considered viable tactics. By the end, we had tanks, poison gas, flamethrowers, and aircraft dropping bombs. The first chlorine gas attack came at Ypres in April 1915, when German forces released this yellow-green cloud that rolled across the trenches. Canadian soldiers who had no gas masks urinated on cloths and held them to their faces, discovering that the ammonia in urine neutralized the chlorine. But gas evolved quickly. Mustard gas, introduced in 1917, didn't kill immediately but blistered the skin, blinded the eyes, and burned the lungs over agonizing days. It could penetrate clothing, contaminate ground for weeks, and there was no effective treatment. Soldiers learned to recognize different gases by smell and color, and the terror of gas attacks never really went away. And yet, amid all this horror, there were moments of almost unbelievable humanity. The Christmas truce of 1914 is the most famous example. In December 1914, after months of brutal fighting, soldiers on both sides began singing carols across no man's land. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers put up small Christmas trees on their parapets, lit with candles. British soldiers responded with their own songs. And then, incredibly, men began climbing out of their trenches, walking across the frozen mud to meet their enemies. They exchanged gifts, cigarettes, photographs of families. They played football together, using tin cans or actual balls where available. They buried their dead together, standing in mixed groups while chaplains said prayers. In some places, the truce lasted a single day. In others, it went on for a week, with soldiers refusing to fire on men they'd shared drinks with. The generals on both sides were furious. They issued strict orders forbidding any future contact with the enemy. The war was too important to be interrupted by human connection. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 became the defining horror of the war. On the first day alone, July 1, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. Many of these were young men who had volunteered together in what were called PALS battalions, whole communities who joined up together. They went over the top, believing their artillery had destroyed German defenses. They walked slowly across no man's land in neat lines, carrying heavy packs, because their officers believed discipline and order mattered more than speed. German machine gunners, who had survived the week-long bombardment in deep dugouts, simply mowed them down. Some units lost 80% of their men in minutes. The battle continued for 4.5 months. The total casualties were over 1 million men. The gain? About 6 miles of muddy ground, most of which was lost again in the German Spring Offensive of 1918. The war wasn't just fought in Europe. It was truly a world war. In Africa, British and French forces seized German colonies, using African soldiers as cannon fodder in campaigns they had no stake in. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany, leading to the disastrous Gallipoli campaign where Allied forces tried and failed to knock Turkey out of the war. Australian and New Zealand troops, the ANZACs, suffered horrific casualties in terrain that was barely survivable even without enemy fire. In the Far East, Japan seized German possessions in China and the Pacific. In the Atlantic, German U-boats waged unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships and nearly starving Britain before convoy systems were introduced. The entry of the United States in April 1917 changed everything, though not immediately. America had stayed neutral, selling supplies to both sides, until German submarine attacks on American ships and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, promising Mexico the return of Texas and other territories if it joined Germany, pushed President Wilson to ask Congress for war. American troops, fresh and enthusiastic, began arriving in significant numbers in early 1918. They were inexperienced, often poorly trained, but they had numbers and morale that the exhausted European armies lacked. When Germany launched its final spring offensive in March 1918, Using troops freed from the Eastern Front by Russia's collapse, American reinforcements helped stop the advance. By August 1918, the Allies, now including significant American forces, began the 100 Days Offensive that pushed Germany back to its borders. The Days Offensive that pushed Germany back to its borders. The end came suddenly. In late October 1918, German sailors' Mutt came suddenly. In late October 1918, German sailors mutinied rather than sail out for a final suicidal battle. Revolution spread through Germany. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice took effect. The guns fell silent. And in the silence, the full horror of what had happened began to sink in. 17 million dead. 20 million wounded. Many maimed for life. Entire generations of young men wiped out in France, Germany, Britain, Austria-Hungary, Russia. The old European order was finished. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires were all gone, replaced by weak new states that would struggle to survive. The seeds of World War II were planted in the harsh peace treaty of Versailles and the economic chaos that followed. In the unresolved grievances and nationalisms that the war had unleashed. But the human cost went far beyond the battlefield. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919, which spread partly because of troop movements and malnutrition, killed more people than the war itself, perhaps 50 million worldwide. The Russian Revolution of 1917, driven partly by war weariness, created the Soviet Union and launched a century of ideological conflict. The Middle East was carved up by Britain and France in ways that created artificial states, whose borders still cause conflict today. The Ottoman Empire's collapse led to the Armenian genocide, to the creation of modern Turkey, to the Balfour Declaration that promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Every major problem of the 20th century, in some way, traces back to this one catastrophic war. So when we look back at World War I, what should we remember? Not just the battles and the treaties, but the ordinary people caught in forces they couldn't control. The 12-year-old boy who lied about his age to enlist and somehow survived. The mothers who lost all their sons. The soldiers who came home with faces destroyed by gas, with minds broken by shell shock, with missing limbs that made them objects of pity in a world that wanted to forget. The women who entered factories and found a kind of independence they wouldn't give up after the war ended. The colonial soldiers who fought for empires that gave them nothing in return. The idealism that died in the mud of Flanders and was replaced by cynicism, by modernism, by the dark irony that characterized so much of 20th century culture. The war was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It wasn't. It was just the beginning of a century of violence that would make the 20th century the bloodiest in human history. But maybe, by understanding it better, by remembering the humanity amid the horror, we can at least honor those who suffered and died, and remind ourselves that the choices leaders make, the alliances they form, the pride they refuse to swallow, can have consequences that echo for generations. The guns fell silent at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, but in many ways, we are still living with their echoes today.